Wood stove or electrical heater? That's the million-dollar question when you're in the market for a sauna. And I'm fortunate enough that I have the wood stove with the sweat tent. I have the electrical heater in our barrel sauna. I also have some infrared saunas here at our home spa. And I've been testing both for a couple of years now to kind of figure out what are the pros and cons so I can make, recommendations and maybe give you some hints that you can apply when you're in the market for a new sauna so you don't make an expensive mistake and then regret what we have purchased. So in this video, we're going to talk about the ambiance, the convenience, heat up time, max temperature, any connectivity settings, cost, obviously, not necessarily from an initial purchase perspective, because, saunas and stoves and ovens, vary price range a lot, but from an ongoing cost, how much does it cost you to run the sauna with wood fired versus with the electrical? And if there are any other considerations, like, if you're off grid, if you're on solar, like we are, we have Tesla solar panels on our roof and batteries. So we kind of conservative when it comes to power consumption. So all of those things we're going to discuss in this video. But before we get into all of that, do me a favor, go to the comments and let me know why you're into sauna bathing. What are some of the top benefits that you're trying to get out of your sauna, out of your future sauna, if you're in the market for one? With that out of the way, let's get started. So let's talk about the ambiance first, because I started sauna bathing when I was a pro athlete back in my early 20s. It was part of our recovery routine. I didn't really quite understand all the benefits and the ins and outs and why heat exposure is so beneficial, but we did it regardless. And I always envisioned, this traditional kind of wood-fired stove where you hear maybe the crackling of the wood, you can smell it maybe even a little bit, and all of that really was part of our sauna experience, and I really liked that a lot. So when we moved to the US years later and I got back into sauna bathing, I kind of envisioned having this traditional Finnish sauna experience. But the reason why I decided not to go with the wood stove was because I figured it would be a major inconvenience having to light a fire every single time I wanted to get into the sauna. I'm not the avid, or at least at the time wasn't the avid outdoor man that I may be now. So, fire making and all of those things weren't really something that I had practiced a lot. And I'm like, nah, you know what? Let's just go with the electrical heater. All I have to do is turn it on and I'm good to go. But one thing that I have noticed, especially when we got the sweat tent here, which comes with a wood stove, and then when we had our experience in Norway, the traditional sauna bathing and cold plunging kind of routine, I realized that there is something special and magical about having a wood stove and doing sauna bathing the traditional way. So that's definitely, I would argue, from that perspective, the wood stove wins from an ambiance perspective, from how it makes you feel when you're in the sauna and enjoy the heat, basically. But speaking of convenience, that was really my main concern I had before getting the sweat tent. How long would it take me to light a fire? How long would the heat up time be? And how would I grow old of having to make a fire every single time I wanted to go into the sauna? And it turns out all of those concerns were unfounded, because A, it's incredibly easy to light fire in a wood stove where, air gets sucked in, there's proper ventilation just based on the design of the wood stove. And if you have dry wood and a little bit of kindling, it takes a couple of minutes and that fire is on. And it also heats up incredibly quick. So I've noticed that I actually prefer lighting a fire, spending 5 minutes on lighting a fire, versus having to go to our electrical heater, turning it on, because it's an analog kind of control. It's not digital. I don't have app connectivity and with that electrical heater. So I basically have to turn it on to preheat. But the problem with that heater is because that knob is so wiggly that setting it for exactly 1 hour of preheat time is difficult. You never get it exactly right. And it also never runs more than an hour. It automatically shuts off after an hour for safety reasons. So that means very often, the heat up time might be only 40 minutes, maybe 50 minutes. And if I don't come down and right away and jump into the sauna, or maybe restart the heating if I'm not quite ready yet, the sauna turns off and it's not as hot as it's supposed to be. So from a convenience perspective, I have to say that lighting a fire in the wood stove is significantly easier and more convenient than dealing with our electrical heater. Now, I agree that if you have maybe a more modern version of that heater that you can control via an application where you just say turn it on, that probably beats it in convenience. But I would still argue that the few minutes it takes you to light the fire, you get all of that back with that experience and with the ambiance that you have with a traditional wood stove. So I would say that the electrical heater maybe can win with convenience, depending on what type of electrical heater you have. In our particular case, the wood stove wins. Let's talk about temperature next, meaning heat up time and max temperature. And again, here I wasn't quite sure how long it would take for the sauna to heat up with a wood stove. And I have to say that within 20 minutes, that sauna is at 200 degrees Fahrenheit. If you let it run, if you add maybe some more wood, it tops out at 240 degrees Fahrenheit. It gets incredibly hot. And this tent is fairly large. It has room for probably 6 persons or so. And despite the volume, temperature inside is just incredibly hot. Of course, you can, have it lower at a lower temperature if you don't add quite as much wood. But nonetheless, if you're into like high intensity, super high heat saunas or wood stove, generally speaking, but in my case with the sweat tent is the way to go. Over here with our electrical heater, I got it to 220, 225, 230, on a good day. But that really depends on the ambient temperature out here. If it's super cold, then chances are every time, when I get in and I have to open the door, it takes then another 30 plus minutes to reach the top temperature. So from a top temperature and heat up perspective, the wood stove in this case wins. For comparison, the heat up with our electrical heater, you want to have it run for a good 45 minutes. I typically try, since, we have this preheat for 1 hour kind of situation going on, I set it to 1 hour. I come down halfway in or so, turn it up again. I get a solid 45 minutes to 60 minutes heat up time so that when I get in, I'm over 200 degrees, 210, usually 215, and then it quickly goes up to 220. And as I said, I've had it once at 230 degrees, but usually it's more between 210 and 220 is what I get. Over here, always above 220. Regardless of what you do, of course, the way I heat it up, I want to have it very hot. So 220 to 240, wood stove again wins in this case. Let's talk about pricing a little bit. That might not be super important if you're rich. Who cares about how much wood is, how much, electricity costs. But since we're on solar, I'm always conservative with electrical power consumption, especially if we have a 240 volts, 50 amp, line here going to the electrical heater, that draws a lot of energy. And so for comparison, our solar panels generate 9.7 kilowatt hours. That's the max on a sunny day like today it can generate. Our sauna here consumes exactly that. So when the sauna is on and running, we generate zero extra electricity, meaning we have purchased from the grid, or we have to use our batteries, which means our batteries are going to be drained sooner. So that has been always one of the reasons why I'm like, do I want to use the electrical heater, the barrel sauna, or maybe something alternative like the infrared or the wood stove? And I've noticed myself gravitating towards something that does not consume quite as much electricity. Now, in terms of actual cost, how much is that? Well, it really depends on how much you pay for electricity where you live. As I said, if you consume, for the sake of argument, the heater is a 10 kilowatt heater, and you can calculate with about 90 minutes of runtime. If you give it a solid hour or so to warm up, and then 30 minutes in the sauna, give or take, let's say 90 minutes, 1.5 hours of runtime. And for, the 10 kilowatts, you would then multiply the 10 kilowatts by 1.5, so 15 kilowatts, and then you multiply that with the kilowatt price in your area on the time of the day, time of the year maybe, and approximately how much each sauna session is gonna cost you. With the wood stove, I've noticed that I burn approximately, I want to say about 3 pieces of wood. So if you buy a bundle of wood that comes with 4, 5, 6 pieces, depending on the size or so you burn approximately through half of it. Over here, if I just go to Ace Hardware, whatever, I pay $7 a bundle or so. So $3.50, give or take, is what a sauna session would cost me if I want to run it at 220 to 240 degrees. If I want to just go lower, I burn 2 bundles and I'm perfectly fine. So that's from a cost perspective. Now, what are some of the other considerations? Well, the other one consideration is maybe safety. With a wood stove, there's fire involved. You want to be careful. Obviously, both, get hot, so you can easily burn yourself. There is no difference between those two. But when there's fire involved, you have to be careful. You want to be on a surface that cannot burn. Like in our case, we have a concrete slab. There is, CO2, carbon monoxide, whatever, poisoning. If there is something wrong with the stove and the fumes come out, if the stove is properly installed and the piping is, the flute is properly installed, there is not really a concern. But theoretically, that could be an issue if something goes wrong or if there's equipment malfunction. Obviously, with the electrical heater, you can get electrocuted if you do something wrong. Again, both get very hot, so I'm always try to stay away from the stove, not get too close to it, not sit right next to it where it could potentially get burned. Wi-Fi connectivity might be another benefit where you say, well, I really like being able to just turn it on my phone, set the temperature, maybe even schedule it so I know it's on at a certain time. That is a clear advantage if you have an electrical heater with Wi-Fi connectivity. The downside of that obviously is you get extra exposure to EMFs, which I try to avoid, generally speaking. And so with a wood stove, it's an analog kind of, there is nothing that could expose you to EMFs, not from an electrical, magnetic, or radio frequency perspective. So again, from a health perspective, probably wood stove, I would argue. From a pure convenience, smart connectivity, all of that perspective, with an electrical heater, you probably have an advantage there. But that's kind of pretty much how those two types of ovens compare, or the heat sources, I want to say. I have to admit that I was skeptical with the wood stove, but ever since we got the sweat tent, I've been converted. I very much prefer the wood stove for the ease of use, in my case, for the experience that I get with it, for the heat that it delivers, for the quick heat up time, without any of the downsides like extra exposure exposure to EMFs or Wi-Fi radiations and all of those things. So I really like the wood stove, but of course, there are cases where the electrical heater might make more sense. If you're indoors maybe where there's no proper ventilation, then obviously you would not go with a wood stove. But that kind of sums it up. But let me know in the comments, what do you think is the better choice for you and why? I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, stick around, subscribe, and maybe share this video with someone who is trying to make a decision and doesn't quite know what to consider.